Okay, here's the second example. Okay, and here are some of the responses I received to that excerpt. This extract is much simpler to me than the last one. It's entitled The Hangover, my imaginary title, because it starts with a repeated slow split chord, the headache, which is regularly repeated. This is then accompanied by the discordant and dilating strings, the stomach. The percussion, throbbing temples, joins in. The head tries to convince the stomach that it's really not that bad, but this gradually gives way to a feeling of utter nausea. I felt physically ill as I listened to it, and as the piece accelerated I felt propelled forwards toward an obvious end. Really felt this one. And another correspondent, wow, I found this to be like an impressionist painting, splashes of colour carefully placed, and it conjured up for me a motorway journey with various traffic conditions possibly ending in disaster. And yet a third, someone climbing down a very long fire escape in New York. That second example was a piece which I manufactured using the iPad app GarageBand. I called it Network just to give it a label for reference, but one thing we may be certain of, no one had heard it before. At a music and philosophy conference in London last year, the eminent Nietzschean scholar Babette Babich said that it was the role of continental philosophy to make explanations more complex rather than less. Now, on the face of it, 1,000 Plateaus by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari very much fits Babich's bill. According to Ian Buchanan, its terminology is abstruse and difficult to engage with, and the presentation of its arguments so long and convoluted it tends to get lost in the exfoliation of the concepts themselves. This image is at the beginning of the chapter they call Rhizome, and compared to the text, it's the epitome of clarity. Now, Deleuze and Guattari themselves distill 6 main concepts from this work, which they outline in their concluding chapter. They are stratification, assemblages, rhizome, plane of consistency, deterritorialization, abstract machines. But for me, the key concept here is that of the rhizome. But it's not botanical considerations that will help us here. Deleuze uses the rhizome as a spatial metaphor in the sense described by Lakoff and Johnson. Let's think of it as a virtually limitless opportunity space where no single location is privileged over any other. This contrasts with what he calls arborescent space, metaphorically tree-like constructions, and as we know, trees have firmly planted roots, trunks, branches and leaves. We have family trees. These are all hierarchical, but rhizomal space is not hierarchical. It's a space which allows for multiple connections from a variety of perspectives that are not rooted in a single concept or small group of concepts. Things happen in this virtual space. Structures crystallize out of it and dissolve away into it. Let's look at some examples of what I would say are rhizomal spaces. This diagram represents what Toynbee calls a space of creative possibilities. At the centre is the social author. A cluster of densely distributed dots around her represent those regularly selected choices required for the competent production of a text in a given genre. Moving out along the radius, an increasingly thin distribution of dots indicates not only the increasing difficulty of making choices beyond the datum of genre, but also a larger and larger space of possibilities. Eventually, inscribed by the end of the radius is a fuzzy perimeter, the blue line you see on the slide, or a virtual horizon of possibility beyond which the author cannot identify any coded voices at all. Now, for social author, we could read any speaker, where the dots in that case would represent vocabulary, and the dotted line a lexical horizon beyond which the speaker cannot go. Or we could read social author as, say, a composer in a particular genre, and the dots as the tools of the trade, keys, time signatures, rhythms, melodies, and so on. The dotted line here represents the boundary beyond which lies, say, atonality or hip-hop or glitch, all stuff which is out with the genre of, say, sonata form. And I'm glad that Toynbee implies that there are elements beyond the horizon of possibilities, because as Wittgenstein pointed out, in order to draw a limit to thinking, we should have to be able to think both sides of the limit. Toynbee uses his diagram to place his social author at its centre. I can't see why a similar diagram could not have me or you at its centre as a social consumer. We are each of us at the centre of our very own limitless rhizomal meaning space. Here's the same diagram again, but this time showing the connecting lines to the choices the author has made, or in my proposed case of the social consumer, the choices and influences upon that consumer. Now, Deleuze calls these connections, the pink lines you can see here, and potential connections between locations in the rhizome, lines of flight. They are the mechanisms by which things connect with each other, the way in Deleuzean terms in which things territorialise and deterritorialise. They manifest the constant state of flux and explain why meanings are not static. The rhizome abhors stasis. So, how might we understand the response of one of my correspondents to my second musical example, the garage band synthesis? Let's consider the hangover analysis. Okay, there's our musical example. The slow split chord leads to a headache. The discordant strings upset the stomach. The percussion leads to throbbing temples, but hey, the head says to the stomach, it's not that bad. But then we're propelled onto a feeling of utter nausea and a definite end. So that's one gestalt of that piece network, which the correspondent described as a hangover. But given the same object of audition in different circumstances, a different gestalt might be constructed. Having considered just the audio clip, I went on to ask contributors to the forum to look at a YouTube video where the same piece of music was accompanied by visual images. Let's have a look at that clip. Okay, the same person who had made the hangover analysis in relation to the purely audio clip had this to say: "This music excerpt for me depicts New York in a very negative way, and it appears threatened in the opening sequence. At first I thought Gotham City and Batman, images of dated artifacts, modern art and Marilyn Monroe made me think of the 1960s, and then images of 9/11 confused me. The stars and stripes prompted thoughts of American politics, gun laws and terrorism as the music drew to a close. I'm not quite sure what statement was being made here. It seemed more like a city in decline rather than a vibrant and forward-looking place because of the music and chosen imagery." Well, I think we'll agree that that's a radically different gestalt, just in virtue of the juxtaposition between sound and images. So, I hope to have shown that gestalten are built and destroyed in rhizomal space by the constant connection and disconnection of Deleuzian lines of flight. Each simple component of a gestalt links to others to form a network of metagestalten and ultimately to form a whole Weltanschauung or worldview. I don't want to give the impression that the mycelial structure is fixed. Every pictorial view of it represents literally a snapshot in time. In the instant immediately preceding the snapshot, it will have looked slightly different, and it will again in subsequent instants. The snapshot in time is the meaning of the Gestalt or Weltanschauung at that moment. Its meaning constantly changes diachronically. Imagine something like a quivering foam, this spindrift on the beach. It's dynamic, it's added to and subtracted from over time. Perhaps you're wondering why I chose the fungal mycelium as my metaphor. Doesn't it look just like neuronal tissue in the brain? Well, yes it does, and I'm sure that neuronal tissue does function in a similar connected fashion, at least we hope it does. But I don't wish to give the impression that this is a theory of cognition or consciousness. It isn't. If we consider a small section of the mycelium, a bit representing a component of a particular gestalt, if you look at nodes A and B, then from our earlier example, they could be the piano chord and headache with the connecting line of flight. But equally, they could represent two attendees at a gig and the discussion between them about the band they've just seen. Or perhaps the nodes might respectively be the whole of Western art music and its connection to, say, Javanese gamelan music. Or they could simply be two computers joined by an internet connection. The point I'm making is that the metaphorical space is universally scalable and doesn't just represent what goes on between our ears. Clearly, some of our gestalten are relatively durable over time, otherwise we couldn't have dictionary definitions of anything. But durable does not imply impervious to change. As Buchanan says, regarding the interplay between the territorialised gestalt and the rhizome's constant desire to deterritorialise it, reality is generally an unstable admixture of the two. And to make the point about just how resilient some territorialised gestalten can be to the entreaties of the rhizome, having seen the clips from the life of Brian, if, whenever you see or hear this, you forever associate it with this.
I think it was blessed are the cheesemakers.
And if that means that you are never again able to hear the Beatitudes without thinking about manufacturers of dairy produce, then I apologise. Thanks for listening.